Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Alumni Relations Program, The Culturally Conscious Lawyer. My name is Shannon Bartlett. I am the law school's Associate Dean of Inclusion and Engagement here at Northwestern, and I'm really happy to have you join us here today. We'll go ahead and get started. So first, just general logistics. I'm going to ask everyone to mute yourselves during the program. We are recording, so we want to make sure we have a clear recording without additional sort of static and that. If you have questions, please feel free to use the chat. I will try to get to them as we go through if I can, but if not, you can always, at the end, we'll definitely leave time for questions. And I'm going to ask you to keep the chat open anyway, because there are going to be parts where I try to make this as interactive as possible. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and provide some feedback or answer some questions, both via poll, but also ask you to chime in on the chat. And you're welcome to either give your answers to everyone, or you can adjust your settings in the chat just to send them to me privately. We are recording it, like I said, make sure you are on mute. Please use the chat area. If you run into technological issues, I recommend either logging off of Zoom and trying to get back in, or contacting Zoom if you continue to have additional problems. If you are here seeking Illinois CLE credit, that's why I'm here as well. I'm at the beginning of the alphabet, so I'm up this year. Take a look at the chat about halfway through. We're going to post a link. We're going to ask you to submit your information, like your bar number and all of that, to verify your attendance here today. And then you'll hear from our department in about a couple of weeks with your CLE credit. So definitely keep an eye out for that. We'll have it posted about halfway through and then at the end of the chat or at the end of the session. So keep an eye out for that information. A little information about me. As I said, I'm the Associate Dean of Inclusion and Engagement here at the law school. I have been here twice. The first time around, I was here from 2013 to 2016 as the Director of Diversity Education and Outreach. This time around, I have been here for about 1.5 years, and I'm here as the Associate Dean of Inclusion and Engagement. And I will say that I present on a lot of topics, but this topic in particular is one that I am particularly passionate about. So I'm excited here to give you an overview of an area that I have been learning a lot about in recent years. Okay. All right, so today, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about culture, just generally. What do we mean when I say that? As lawyers, it's important for us to have shared definitions as we explore concepts. We're going to do a sort of quick intro into some key cross-cultural concepts. There's a lot out in the literature about cross-cultural competency, but I'm going to focus on a couple things that I think come up particularly in the workplace and particularly for lawyers. And I will try to tailor it as much as I can to what might happen in my previous life. I was a lawyer. I still am a lawyer, as evidence why I'm motivated to get CLE through doing some of these presentations. But I practiced in big law. I worked in a nonprofit. I've worked in a small firm as well. And I've also been in higher ed for the past 10 years at law schools. So I try to tailor a lot of the concepts to things that I have seen or experienced, both as a practicing lawyer representing clients, but then also just someone working with lawyers and law students every day. Then we'll do something a little bit more interactive, where we're going to test out some of the concepts that we've talked about and see how they play out in how we think about ourselves, how we think about one another. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about putting it all together. So we'll explore some concepts, we'll practice seeing them in action, and then we're going to talk about how they may manifest in the legal workplace specifically. I'll provide some resources if you're interested in learning more, and then at the end, we'll definitely leave time for Q&A. So with that, let's get started. We're going to talk about Culture 101. So I want to ask you to open your chat here if you haven't already done so, and you can tailor it again to speak to send your answers to me directly or to everyone on the chat. But I'm going to ask a question, a foundational one for today's conversation, which is, when you see the word culture, what comes to mind? Are there specific things? Is there a definition? What do you think of when you see the word culture? Go ahead and write your answers in the chat. All right, we have shared values. What else do we think of when we think of see the word culture, or someone is talking about culture? Experiences, traditions, rituals, art, society, community. All right. They are all, we've got a lot of answers pouring in. commonalities among a group, belief systems. I like this one. A culture is the constructed web that our society exists within. So those are all really great answers. And a lot of them are pretty consistent with what I would use as a definition, submit to you as a definition, that when I'm thinking about it, which is a socially constructed set of assumptions, values, and beliefs of a group of people by which they organize their common life. And so what does that mean? A lot of times when we think of culture, we think of some of the more tangible things. Some of you talked about art, some people talked about religion, some people talked about, you think about food or music. Those are very tangible, concrete, discrete cultural differences that are easy for us to recognize. When I talk about culture here today, and the concept that I really want to explore is going to focus more on the aspects of culture that we don't necessarily realize are culturally based. And those are going to be the assumptions, those are going to be our values, that's going to be how we operate in our spaces and sort of what we think about when we say, this is how we do things around here, right? We're going to talk about communication, we're going to talk about conflict, we're going to talk about all these things where we may not actually realize they're culturally based or culturally derived. Okay. So when I'm talking about that type of culture, so the less concrete, it's not food, it's communication, it's conflict. That kind of culture we think about is actually learned and transmitted from generation to generation unconsciously. And that isn't different from learning a recipe that is passed down from our grandfather or learning a song that's passed down from that's been passed down through the family. That's consciously transmitted culture. What I'm talking about in terms of how you behave, how you interact with one another, what your expectations are of the people around you, those are all things that we tend to take in and internalize from the time we're very small. And that's how you communicate, how you engage, all of those things, and we'll explore those a little bit more fully. But that's what I'm talking about, the culture that we're not actually conscious of being culturally based. So when we talk about being culturally conscious, what does that mean? So that means, and we'll get a little more into this, but really having the ability to shift your perspective and realize that there are different cultural perspectives. And then the second piece, which is harder for many of us, is to actually adapt our behavior to that difference. So when we talk about this in the lawyering concept, in the context of being a lawyer, it's going to be the ability of a lawyer to perform successfully the functions that attorneys perform in society when dealing with colleagues, when dealing with clients, and other people who are from different cultures. In terms of the components of culturally conscious lawyering, we're going to think about that in 4 different ways. One is, do we recognize cultural differences around him or her, right? So we know that food is different, Italian food is different from Mexican food, but do we know that the way people interact, the way people communicate, the way they handle conflict is different? Do we pick up on those cultural differences? If we do see them, how respectful of them are we when we see them? Are we saying they're just wrong, there's something wrong with them? Or do we say, okay, that's a difference, that could be culturally based, and I'm going to be respectful of that, even if it's not the way I do things. Oops. And then we're going to say, okay, we see it, we recognize it, that it's there, we're respectful of it. How confident are we to actually reconcile those differences? Do we realize a conversation needs to be had? And if we do realize that conversation needs to be had about how to effectively navigate that cultural difference, how confident are we in actually navigating that effectively? So a lot of us are going to be we're going to be able to do the first 3 pretty effectively. We're going to recognize a cultural difference, we're going to be respectful of it, and we're going to realize that probably we have to have a conversation. But most of us, and I put myself in this category as well, are not necessarily very effective in actually navigating that conversation or what has to be done effectively. And I'm going to provide some tips, I think, to at least help you get started in thinking about these as we go. But note that it's a work in progress. It's a journey and not a destination. And it takes a lot of time to get or confident at these things. And something else I want you to keep in mind is culture works on a lot of different levels. So where you can talk about socially, society, we can recognize that the culture in Italy may be different than the culture in Spain. So we're thinking on the large scale, but we also want to think about microculture as well. So the culture of a space in our organizations, even within an organization, do different departments have their own culture about the way they engage? So I encourage you to think of culturally, both in terms of the large scale, but then also in terms of even in the spaces you work in, do you recognize that there are differences in how people engage, are expected to engage in different departments or within your own institution or organization? Because culture works on all of those different levels. Okay, so with that, we're going to address pretty briefly some key cross-cultural concepts I'd like you to think about as we continue through our conversation. Those I'm going to focus on today, and there are a lot more than this, but for today's conversation, I want to talk about 6 in particular that I want to focus on. And so one is going to be collectivism and individualism. Another is going to be communication style. Another is evaluating, leading, trusting, and scheduling. So, and these are all concepts that I've decided to focus on because I think that they can help, understanding them can help promote effective cross-cultural interactions, especially in the legal place and with clients. Okay. All right. The first is the individualism dimension. So what this is a way of measuring the degree to which action in a specific culture is taken in for the benefit of the individual or the group. So that's going to sound exactly what it looks like. So an individualistic society is a culture of the self where individuals are supposed to take care of themselves and they have an independent relationship with social groups. Okay, what does that mean? What that means is that in a society that's more individualistically focused, you know, you're going to see a lot of nuclear families where it's, you know, it's nuclear families living together, parents and children, but you don't see a lot of extended family as part of the family unit. So not a lot of, you know, grandparents or cousins or and you're expected to make decisions to your benefit, even if they may undermine the benefit or have a negative impact on someone else within your family, extended family. In contrast, in a collectivist society, the preference is belonging to the we. So that's a lot of collectivist cultures you're going to see the extended family all living together. So aunts and uncles and close to one another, grandparents. And the expectation is that your decision making will all be focused on the group and what's in the group's best interest or social welfare. And so in that sense, I might take a job that is great for me, but that takes me away from my family or something like that. And in a collectivist society, that's not how you make decision making. You're always going to be focused on the we. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn to our first poll, and I'm going to open up a question for you to answer, which is 2 people were discussing ways in which individuals could improve their quality of life. Which of the 2 ways of reasoning below do you think is usually best? And the first is it is obvious that if individuals have as much freedom as possible and the maximum opportunity to develop themselves, the quality of their way of life will improve as a result. And your second option is if individuals are continuously taking care of their fellow human beings, the quality of life will improve for everyone, even if it obstructs individual freedom and individual development. So just take a look at those and let me know which one you think best reflects sort of your philosophy or what you think the best way is to make decisions. And I'll give you a few more. All right, we're about 60% of you have voted. We'll get up to about 70 and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. Okay, so we've got about 70% of our responses in, and actually about 80% of you so far have selected the second option, which is individuals are taking care of one another, the quality of life will improve for everyone, even if it means that individual freedom and individual development may need to be obstructed. So that answer is actually, some people, if you're in between, you know, it's hard choices we have to make. It's hard choices we have to make. So anyway, the second answer is sort of more reflective of what you'd see sort of the collectivist way of thinking, whereas the first answer tends to be reflect more of an individualistic way of thinking. So I go and close that poll. I will share the results so you can see how you all answered. Anyway, and just for sort of a fun exercise, you'll see that when this question was asked of others across the world, you'll see that the first option was the one that was more focused on the individual, sort of individualistic approach, and a lot of other places answer the question very differently. So 69, you guys are an unusual group of people because, as you can see, 70% of people who usually answer this question choose the first option in the United States when they gave it before. So it's a very collectivist group here, which I appreciate. Okay, so how can this play out at work, right? Is something question you might be asking. It's kind of a fun question, fun concept, but how does this play out in your sort of everyday work? And part of it is going to be, how do you focus on decision making in even within your own organization? As a leadership of an institution, are you making decisions that are best for individuals that might undermine sort of the collective well-being, or are you focused on, let's make sure as many people are okay with this decision or not negatively impacted by this decision? And those are very different ways of making institutional decisions, particularly in the climate that we're in, right? But even in the small case, and certainly as lawyers, not understanding that your client may be much more focused on the we when you're thinking about representation can have an adverse impact as well, and can lead to some misunderstandings, because if you're focused on like, this deal is the best deal for you personally, the person's your client's orientation may be much more focused on, I don't care about the I care about the we, and how does this particular decision impact others around me, my family members, my company, and all of that. There are very different ways of orienting decision making, and so it's something to keep in mind, both in terms of larger cultural, thinking about larger cultural groups, but also the microcultural groups within your organization. And someone is making a good point about self-selection here, so in terms of our audience. All right, next I want to talk briefly about different styles of communication, and we're going to talk about direct versus indirect, and those are very much as how they sound. Some cultures are very direct, while others are more indirect. So what does that mean? In direct, or what we call low context cultures, good communication is precise, simple, and clear. So messages are expressed and understood at face value. So that means what you see on this paper, what I articulate to you, you can take that to the bank, whatever that means. That it is exactly as I have said. There are no sort of questions. What do direct cultural strategies look like? So meanings inside the verbal message, precise, explicit use of language, very reliance on face-to-face resolution. Let's talk through this, let's talk it out. We're very comfortable verbally asserting our differences of opinion with one another directly and concretely. Let's talk through things using reasoned argument. Here are my 3 points about why I'm right. Desire to rely on objective information, and a huge reliance on verbal and written communication. I'm gonna write this out, I'm gonna write down everything, you're gonna see everything that I think. I like to get straight to the point, and there's more of a focus on problems and solutions. So that sounds great, right? Well, let's talk about indirect or high context cultures. And in that sense, in indirect cultures, good communication is very layered. So messages are spoken and read between the lines, and messages are often implied but not plainly expressed. So someone from an indirect culture would not say, I expressly disagree with your assessment or your decision, but would say things around that imply it, that require you to really tune in and listen to understand what is the message being conveyed. So you cannot rely on verbal messaging when you're working with people who have more indirect ways of communicating. A lot of ambiguity and vagueness in language, a lot of metaphors and analogies. There's a lot of reliance on, instead of directly engaging when there's a conflict, actually relying on third parties to resolve it and to talk through things. Rather than saying, I disagree with you, I think that's the wrong decision. A lot of talking around differences of opinion. A lot of persuasion through face work. Let's get together, let's have coffee, let's talk things out, but not talk about things directly. Relying more on context and understanding. You can't really rely on verbal and written communication, more on the context. Oops, sorry. And then there's more hinting and suggesting the main point rather than saying it directly. All right, so with that, I'm going to open up the next question. So I'm going to ask you, based on now you have those definitions of what communication styles are, tell me, what kind of communicator are you? Are you indirect or direct? Okay. All right, we've got about 70% of the votes in, and not surprisingly, I think we have about 80% of you have indicated that you are direct. About 20%, we're having about 20% who think of themselves as indirect. Although I see in the chat, some of you, as lawyers do, are wanting to challenge the question by saying, well, it depends, it depends. There's no depending here. It's sort of what is your preferred way of communicating? These are very different ways of communicating, and I'm a self-professed direct communicator. And kind of a fun fact is that the United States tends to be one of the more direct cultures, and part of that is because it's by necessity. A lot of cultures that tend to be more indirect have far less diversity than the United States. The United States, in part because it is a country founded on, where people coming from all over the world had to be direct. So indirect cultures tend to be very homogeneous, background, shared history, shared historical context, a shared sort of understanding. So you can actually use less language to communicate in indirect culture because you're pretty homogeneous. In a heterogeneous society, you actually have to communicate a lot more expressly by necessity because you don't have a shared history, you don't have a shared context. So a lot of cultures that are actually more direct have more words actually in their language than cultures that are more indirect because you need less information to communicate. And I will say direct communication styles versus indirect communication styles tend to be one of the largest sources of conflict in workplaces. And I know certainly as someone who is very direct, it sometimes is difficult for me to navigate working with indirect. And so one of the things to think about is how can you do that more effectively? And I'll get to that in 1 second. But before that, I thought it'd be fun to kind of talk through one interesting way to get a sense of what a culture's preferences are is looking at proverbs. So nothing done with intelligence is done without speech. Do we think that that is a direct culture or an indirect culture? Feel free to drop it in the chat, your guess on that one. Yes, direct. Hear one and understand 10 is a Japanese proverb. Do we think that that is direct or indirect? Yes, indirect. Say what you mean and mean what you say, American proverb. What do we think about that? Direct, absolutely. All right, this is my personal favorite. It is good to know the truth, but it is better to speak of palm trees. You're right. It is indirect because it's good to tell the truth, but let's talk about the weather instead, right? So anyway, so that's just kind of a fun way to get a sense of how does a culture think about communication styles. So that's well and good, but how do you actually navigate that in the workplace more effectively? And things about, and these are personal lessons for me because like I said, I tend to be very direct and it's something that I've had to evolve over time to learn how to communicate better with people who are indirect, is we can't form opinions too quickly. If you're very direct, you're used to just sort of saying, this is what I think, and here's what I think, and da, 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 and your expectation is that other people do the same thing. And when you're not hearing that direct communication that's very expressed, it can be, we can form assumptions very quickly about the people with whom we're engaging. We have to listen more, speak less, and clarify. And I had an experience recently with a colleague who I adore, but who's very indirect. And so what I've learned to do is to make sure that I don't have meetings scheduled after that person so that we can have the time to really, really sort of unpack everything that's happening in our interaction. And I would note that there were things that the person would say where I would think, I would kind of brush off because I would think, well, that's not really relevant to what I think we're talking about. But when it would come up 2 or 3 times, I'd finally say, so I noticed you said this a couple of times, and I don't know sort of the significance of that or the relevance of that to what we're talking about. And then being able to ask clarifying questions and say, oh, okay, now I see how this is connected for you in a way that was not really directly obvious to me. So learning to really listen and key into the things that even that they don't seem relevant or important to you, if someone's saying them over and over again, not directly, then you have to sort of ask. So making sure you're listening more and speaking less and asking clarifying questions. And when I say clarifying questions, I do not mean interrogating. I do not mean asking, yes or no questions. I mean, asking open-ended questions. One of the worst ways to communicate with someone who's indirect is to just ask yes, no questions, because you may get a yes or a no, but you're not getting the unwritten part of the yes, but that actually makes it a no, or you'll get the no, but you're not getting the it's actually kind of a yes. So you have to stick more to open-ended questions and resist the lawyer's desire to interrogate into yes or no questions. And this is something that I also have personally struggled with over time, which is, do not assume that someone is purposely omitting information or unable to communicate or understand because they are not speaking directly. And that has been particularly, I think, for working with clients or colleagues, where if you're very direct, you have a tendency to think, well, this person isn't telling me what to know, they're not conveying that information directly, so therefore they must be not, you know, they must not be, they must be being dishonest, they must be trying to hide something. And in reality, it's just you have to take a different approach to how you're communicating to better understand what's happening in the conversation. You have to read the air in the cultural competence space, where they say you're reading everything in the interaction around what else is happening in the interaction that's not necessarily being expressed directly verbally or in writing. Okay, so next I want to talk about evaluating dimension, and that is just to how feedback is being given. And this is something I think particularly for those of you working in spaces where you have to give evaluation regularly, is to think about there are very different ways to how people prefer to give feedback. Cultures that tend towards direct negative feedback, you give it very frankly. You're like, yeah, that was not a good job on your part and you need to be better, and you can do it bluntly and honestly. Don't soften that message at all, and you can do that sort of openly. So you're going to be on your project and you're like, that was just, you know, not good work and I expect better next time. And that's fine. That's not considered to be a bad way of getting feedback. In contrast, cultures that tend towards indirect negative feedback tend to give negative feedback to colleagues subtly, diplomatically. You wrap the messages around negative ones, and you should do it in private. So you may ask yourself, well, actually, do you have a picture of a sandwich on this slide? And I will tell you, because we refer to this approach as the crap sandwich. Usually we use an expletive. I'm trying to be more professional. So a crap sandwich, in the sense that you want to layer the bad stuff between the good stuff. So like, you did this really well. Now you really messed this up and this is catastrophic, but you also did this thing okay, right? So you're trying to wrap it up. Those are very different ways of giving feedback. And I'm going to ask you, as you think about your approach to your preference to feedback, to tell me how you like to receive your own feedback on your work. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that poll. So let me know. Do you like it just direct and straight, or would you prefer more of the crap sandwich? Okay. All right, so we've got about 70% of the votes in. We are at about 60% who say I prefer direct negative feedback. And we have about 40% who are at I prefer indirect negative feedback. I have a comment that someone says I prefer, you know, getting direct feedback by myself, but I prefer to give indirect feedback. And I think that that's probably pretty common, actually, for those of us to be like, just tell it to me straight. But then when we're giving it to other people, we don't want to be in the position of giving that in that way. But these are keep in mind, these are very different approaches to giving feedback. And you want to be mindful of trying to understand the people with whom you're working, how to give that feedback and understanding their preferences. Now, interestingly, the United States, while tending to be the most, one of the most direct cultures in terms of communication in the world, actually we pretty much like our feedback to be indirect and less direct. So that is an interesting sort of dichotomy or sort of an interesting fun fact for the United States. Be direct unless you're giving me feedback, in which case I want my crap sandwich. But also, again, something to think about when you're in your workplace, that people have different preferences, and you might want to do some work to understand how those preferences play out when you're giving feedback. We're going to talk about the leading dimension, and this is going to be pretty straightforward too. It's how egalitarian or hierarchical culture is. So in egalitarian cultures, the ideal distance is between a boss and subordinate is low. So it's a very flat structure. You know, the boss is considered a facilitator. Organizational structures are flat. The person, you know, who's clerical support can email the CEO and it's not that big of a deal. So communication skips hierarchical lines. It's just very flat. Think of it as a very flat horizontal structure. In contrast, we have the opposite of that, which is hierarchical cultures, where there's a lot of distance between a boss and a subordinate. So, and all communication has to flow through that, that chain. And you do not skip communication lines. So it would not be appropriate for someone who's, you know, administrative support to email the CEO without it going through the boss. So anyway, those are very different ways of organizing. And this is, again, where you want to think about culture in lots of different, from both the sort of larger, in the larger sense, in terms of how, you know, our societies are organized versus how our organizations are organized. So for me, working in law, I consider law, both in terms of the profession, but also the legal education, to be fairly hierarchical. But in general, we think of United States as being, having a pretty egalitarian bent, at least sometimes in some parts of our history. And so now I'm going to open up my next question, which is to think about, for you, your leading preferences. So what are your thoughts on hierarchies in the workplace specifically? So not thinking about culture largely, but in your workplace. Do you prefer hierarchies where there's very clear, everything has its place and flows through that structure? Or are you like, you know, hierarchies are a thing of the past, I'm looking for my flat structure? Okay. All right, so we're at about 70% in, and we're about 75% are saying hierarchies are a thing of the past. I prefer, you know, kind of the more flat egalitarian and then we still have about 30% that are saying, you know what, I like hierarchy. I think everything has its place, and you know, we should respect that. So that's pretty pretty typical. Okay, so there we are with that. But again, something to think about, that in your workspaces, people are going to have very different sort of assumptions about what the leading structure should be. And particularly as you get more millennials and younger people in your spaces who tend to be far more egalitarian in their expectations about how a workplace should be organized. And those are things you're going to have to think through about how to navigate ththose differences effectively. Yes, and then for the question in the chat, there is definitely a lot more sort of younger people, particularly students and people that we work with, who are, hierarchies are a thing of the past, and they expect to have equal status to everyone else. And those are things that the legal workplace, which again, I think of as being traditionally very hierarchical, will have to think through how to navigate effectively. Okay, so continuing on our journey into key cross-cultural concepts is the trusting dimension, which is how trust is built in a culture. And again, thinking of culture both in terms of the broad sense, but also in terms of your organization. So in task-oriented cultures, trust is built through business-related activities. Work relationships are built and dropped easily. And if you do good work consistently and are reliable, I trust you. So what does that mean? That means I work with you, I give you an assignment, you do a good job, we're good, I trust you, right? That's all I need. I don't need to know the names of your children, I don't need to know, you know, where you're from, I don't need to know anything about you except you did this assignment, it was good. I might not need you for 5 years or, you know, 3 months, but another assignment that seems good for you, I will go find you and give it to you. So that's when we talk about relationships being dropped, built and dropped easily. It is totally about the task at hand that I need from you. Very differently is the what we call in relationship-oriented cultures, and that where trust is built through getting to know you personally. So work relationships are built up slowly over the long term. I've shared personal time with you. I know who you are. I know the names of your children and your family. I know everything about you, where you're from. And because of that, I'm going to trust you to give you work to do. And then if you do a good job, I'll keep doing that. But, you know, I may not have something for you for a few months or maybe even 3 years, but we're going to stay in touch. So that is very different. So it's not just like, I'm going to drop the relationship and then when we need you again, I'm going to come back for you. It's going to be, you're still checking in and asking me, you know, how I'm doing and how you're doing and things like that. So that it's actually a relationship versus that persist beyond the tasks and not just focused on what you need from one another. Those are very different ways to build trust individually or cross-culturally. How this can play out when you're thinking more international culture. So if you're working in you're trying to get business for my brother, he's worked in a national company and travels a lot, and he would talk about doing in a couple countries that are much more relationship oriented cultures, where he would have to go down there time and time again over the course of a year to get to really know people, to have dinner, to have coffee and things like that. And over time, after that relationship is built, then they would have the business relationship. Whereas in other places, you just go, you meet, you never leave the boardroom, you establish the business relationship, and then it's done. So those are very different ways of orienting yourself, building trust. So with that, I'm going to open up our next poll and ask your thoughts as you reflect on how you like to work with others and how they build trust with you and how you build trust with them. What do you focus on? Is it just do good work and we're great? It's not personal, it's just business? Or is it, I need to know the people who I trust to do my work? It's business, which means it has to be personal as well. Okay, so we're at about 70% of you have responded, and about 60% of you are actually leaning towards relationship oriented in terms of how you do your work, and we got about 40% of you are identifying as more task oriented. I think what's interesting is that the United States in general, as you focus, tends to be more task oriented, just sort of overall. So it is interesting in terms of this group that we tend to be more you're identifying more as relationship oriented. But again, as you think about being in your particular workspace and how you build trust within your organization and who you're working with, you're going to want to make sure that you are focused on aware that other people are oriented a little bit differently. And so thinking through how do you navigate that effectively. Okay. All right, now if you don't remember anything else that I shared with you today, I'm going to ask you to remember this, because there are two areas where you tend to get a lot of workplace conflict. One of them we've already covered, which is differences in communication styles. Oops, let me check here. Okay. Which is, and this is going to be the second one, which is how we think about time. So we think about time very differently. And you may say, what does that mean? So I'm going to talk about two different ways. One is cultures with a linear approach to time. Think about time being in a very sequential fashion. So you complete one task before another, you do one thing at a time without interruptions, and the emphasis is on promptness, predictability, and punctuality. So in reality, what this means is that, I expect that we have a meeting at 5 o'clock, you're there at 5 o'clock, and then I have a meeting at 5:30, and then at 6, and things like that. So the focus is on, predictability, punctuality, everything being in its order. And if you think about that, that's sort of conceiving of time as being a point that's constantly moving, so you never get time back. It's just gone, right? Once that moment has passed. There's a very different way of thinking about time. And this is going to be the flexible approach to time. And so what does this mean? It means that you sort of a lot of multitasking, interruptions are accepted and happen all the time, focuses on flexibility. This is what I recall, and you might ask, why do I have a bowl? So it would be a bowl, think about time in this way, is it's a constantly refilling, right? Like there's always more time coming from somewhere. So that moment passed, but that's okay because there's going to be more time to do other things. I call this the cable company approach to time, because rather than punctuality and predictability being the focus of things, it's focus is on, well, I didn't know what would come up. And so rather than saying I have to be there at 4, you're like, well, 4 is really just a suggestion. So if I come at 4:30 or 5 or 4:15, you know, that's no big deal. Those are very different ways of thinking about time. I have some family friends who got married and they were in an intercultural relationship, and they actually came up with 2 different sets of invitations for the wedding, one of which had the time set for the wedding an hour earlier than the other set that went to one side of the family, and that was in recognition of the fact that that side of the family had a very more fluid approach to time, and if they wanted the ceremony to start the time they wanted to start, they had to take into account that people's approach to time is very differently. I've seen this play out both in terms of like personally and professionally working with students. So there's some students where I'm like, okay, well, I know that student will always be a few minutes late. And so this can drive people really, really up the wall, because if we are more linear, and I put myself in that category, if we are more linear in our approach to time, our assumption when someone is not on time is that they are being deliberately disrespectful of us and not appreciative of our time, right? And that may not be the case. So I'm launching the poll. I'm going to ask you, do you consider yourself to be more linear in your approach, or are you more flexible in your approach? Okay, so we're about 70%. About 70% of you said you focus on punctuality and predictability, so you're going to identify as more linear in terms of your approach to time, and about 30% of you identified as more flexible. So the question or the comment that I always get from when I do this presentation for students is just like, what is the value? What possible value can there be in a flexible approach to time? And you know, it doesn't matter if there's a value, they're just different cultural approaches to time. But one of the things is that when something comes up, it allows you the flexibility to say, you know what, this thing came up, I didn't know this phone call would come in as I was scheduled to walk out the door, and I'm going to finish up this conversation, or things like that. So it's just more of an appreciation for the flexibility of things, the unpredicted things that come up. Whereas you're very sort of timed with punctuality. If something gets off course, you may miss an opportunity, miss a conversation, and have regrets about that. One fun sort of tip is if you are traveling internationally and you notice that cultures that tend to be more flexible in approach to time, one of the key indicators of that is how lines work. So if you're at a place that's very linear, people line up and your sort of place in the line is sacred. I got here, this is where I was, it is my turn. And when it is my turn, you get all the attention to be focused on me. In places that are more flexible, lines have no meaning. So I was traveling internationally, there's a place that's much more flexible approach to time, and I was in line at the airport, and like the line did not matter at all. People were like running up there, kind of cutting all the stuff, and I was like furious, but it's just a different approach. It's a different approach to time and sort of multitasking and all of that. But anyway, the one key point that I just want to make is that these are very different approaches to time, and sometimes people are just being disrespectful to you, right, by not showing up on time, but sometimes it's just we have a different approach to time, and then how it manifests may be very different. So for some people, and think about in your life, at what point do you feel if you're running late, do you feel like you have to call? Is it if you're 5 minutes late, if it's 10 minutes late, is it if you're an hour? And for some people, it's just you call right away. And what that window is before you have an obligation to sort of reach out will differ a lot based on sort of how flexible or linear your approach to time is. Okay. And I see in the chat that there are some questions about the form. So I asked one of my coworkers to sort of see if we can figure out what's going on with the form, and so hopefully we'll have the answer for you there. So now we're going to ask you a couple of quick activities to kind of highlight how we think about how these concepts may play out differently. For some of you, you may excuse me. So for some of you, if you came to my program a few weeks ago, you've seen this picture before, but I'm going to ask you to open up, if you have the comments open, to write down in the comment board what you see when you see this particular picture that I'm about to show you. First thing that comes to your mind. Okay, so we're getting lots of opinions coming in. Some of them are obnoxious, irresponsible, entitled, selfish, secretive. So lots of strong feelings about this. So what this is called is a die exercise. So I'm going to go back briefly to the previous slide. Actually, the other way. And a die exercise in the cultural competence space is a description, interpretation, and evaluation exercise. And what that goes to is that when we take in information or we see it, we go through these three phases, but we tend to go through them quickly. So description is we see it, right? And we identify what's happening. So most of you identify that there was a car and the car was parked, right? And then you interpret it. So we assign some meaning to what we saw. So for many of us, when we see that car, we see it parked across the lines. We see it's an expensive model car. Maybe, I don't know anything about car, but it looks expensive. And so we're thinking, this person deliberately parked across. We're interpreting that they parked across the lines because it's a car and the person is obnoxious and entitled. And then we're evaluating and we're passing judgment. So that's when we get to this person is entitled, this person is that. So, but we do all that instantaneously. So you saw the picture and immediately we were already in the judgment space, right? Where we are attaching judgment and evaluating the person's, what we perceive to be the person's motivation. So we do that very quickly. We see the information, we interpret it through our predictive models, as we talked about last time, and then we judge it or evaluate it. And that is really deeply problematic because I see some of you are noting in the comments, there may be other alternative explanations for why the car is parked that way. Maybe there was snow when the person parked there and it all melted. Maybe there was an emergency and the person at the hospital and the person parked there and got out of the car. There are other reasons for why that car might have been parked that way, but our brain actually is lazy. So it relies on information we've taken in before and relies on stuff we previously made. In the past, we've had taken information that suggests if you have a fancy car and you're parked across the lanes, you are being selfish because you're taking up spaces because you don't want any cars next to you, because you don't want to get your car nicked, right? But we don't actually have enough information to suggest that's the reason. So what you want to be mindful of is engaging what we call the parallel universe habit, which is when you see yourself making these sort of strong judgments, going back and asking yourself to describe what did you actually see objectively. I saw a car, it was parked between lanes. What are the possible interpretations of that? The person is entitled, or there was an emergency, or there was snow, or there's information that I don't have. And only once you've done that, you've walked through that exercise and have ascertained what the reason is behind it, should you be evaluating or making those assessments. And it's a minor thing, assessing someone's character negatively who's parked a car. But as a colleague, if you're working with someone and you're taking information and you've made pretty strong judgments about them that are negative, and you haven't done the work to understand, is this person late because they are disrespectful of my time, or do they just think about time differently, which place we need to have a conversation. But because our brain does that so quickly, we don't always realize that we have made pretty harsh assessments or evaluations of people's character, and it's hard to walk that back, right? If you saw the person walking out to that car, we've already decided that they're an entitled jerk, right? How do you walk that? How do you get your brain to be like, I don't have enough information to do that? And we're working with colleagues and we're working with clients. We want to be mindful that we're not making those judgments, and they're so difficult to walk. And this is just a quote that I really like, which is, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are, right? We have assumptions about how people are supposed to behave or engage. And because of that, we see everything through that lens. We see the car parked there and assume who the person is. Okay, so really quickly, I'm going to do another poll, which I will launch. But here's the question that you will see. Which is, tell me, how would you personally feel if you had a disagreement or conflict with another person at work and that individual did not want to directly discuss the situation or problem with you? So if you're really uncomfortable with that, you're going to be a 1. If you're like, whatever, I'm good with that, that's a 6. Oh, okay, so we're at about 70%, and it looks like the bulk of you are really uncomfortable with this, are very unhappy with this. Only about 16% of you are 4 or above. The rest of you, I'm bad at math, the rest of you are really, really uncomfortable with this. If you're okay, I'm going to ask you to drop in the chat. If you were 1 or 2 or let me know why. And again, you can respond to me privately or you can respond to the chat. Why are you a 1 or 2? Why does this make you so uncomfortable that someone is upset, and we'll discuss it with you. Okay, so it looks like most of you are saying it's because I don't have the opportunity to discuss it. Like, how can we fix it or get to the bottom of things if we can't actually discuss it? It keeps things going. Okay, so now if you are it looks like one of the 16 people who picked a 6 or a 5, or 8 people who picked a 6 or a 5, can you let me know what you think? Why are you okay with not talking about it? Anyone? So someone says creating other issues. Okay. Some people are saying, it kind of depends on the context. Well, so a lot of times, some people, when we do this in the law school with students are just like, it's fine. Like, someone doesn't want to talk about it, it's just fine. Like, how does it impact me if they don't want to talk about it? That's a very different way of thinking about conflict. And so really quickly, I'm going to ask you to answer another question for me, which is, how would you personally feel expressing strong emotions such as anger during a disagreement or conflict at work? And again, same scale, uncomfortable is a 1, comfortable is a 6. Okay, so we got answers coming in. So we've got about 80% of you are between 1 and 3 on this, saying like, I'm really uncomfortable with showing strong emotion such as anger or disagreement at work. We've got about 20% of you who are at 4 or above. So if you're 4 or above, tell me why you're okay or why you'd be comfortable showing strong emotions such as anger or conflict at work. So a lot of times when we do this with students is, people are saying, I'm comfortable, like it's fine, right? So people are saying it's being true to myself, it makes things clear, it's showing other people how I'm feeling about things and how their behavior sort of is impacting me. You're telling people like you see it. So it's why should I not share that with others? If you're more of a 1 to 3, let me know why you would be so uncomfortable displaying strong emotions at work. Okay, so someone's saying it makes you irrational at times. It can be a lot of people are pointing out that as a woman, it can make you, we can be seen as negative. Certainly someone earlier in the poll was pointing out that as a woman of color, but there are also sort of stereotypes associated with that. So people are saying, by showing strong emotion, that it's negatively impacting others as well. Okay, so these are all very consistent with sort of a lot of the answers and where we end up with when we do the same with students. And so what those questions get to are 2 things. The first one is getting to, are you direct or indirect? So a lot of you are like, how can we discuss it or figure out what's wrong if we're not discussing it? Versus the other approach, which is like, why discuss it? So the interesting thing is both of those approaches are focused on relationships, right? If you're direct, you're like, we need to be able to repair our relationship, and the only way to do that is I respect you, so I want to know how we can fix this. And if you're indirect, actually, it's also about respecting the relationship. I respect you so much that I don't actually want to have a conversation about this. We should just let it drop. So this is it's good to tell the truth, but let's talk about palm trees instead, right? So let's respect the relationship and just not address this directly. Those are very different ways of approaching communication. And the second gets to expressiveness, which is how comfortable are you displaying strong emotions? So the last poll I have for you today is you're thinking about, do you identify as emotionally restrained, which is, as you can see there, let me pull this up. Which is, I'm like a duck, serene on the surface, my legs paddling frantically below the surface, and people who tend to be more restrained are focused on less displays of nonverbal behavior, less variation in speech. People who are they tend to be concerned that displaying emotion will hurt other people's feelings or look unprofessional. People who are more comfortable expressive are like, this is, I'm gonna show you how I feel. And that's essential for ensuring that our relationship is respectful. Right? Again, these are both different ways of thinking about respect. For people who are restrained, I show respect for you by not showing you strong emotions, because I view that as being impactful on you if I display strong emotions. And people who are expressive are also saying, I respect you. I want you to know how this impacted me in a real way. Again, oriented very differently, both seeking out the same thing, which is respect. And some people are saying it may depend based on whether it's personal or business, and I think that's an important thing to think about. But it also goes to what is the culture of your space, because I know I tend to be, as Cliff is on here, Cliff knows that, I tend to be more expressive naturally, but I end up adapting to other people's style, and there's a real question as to, should I have to adapt, right? Do I need to be someone else other than my authentic self in a space because it makes other people more comfortable? And that's just a legitimate question. I'm not suggesting that there is an answer, but it is something to think about, that people are naturally oriented differently, and we think about these differently. I won't go through these, but again, Proverbs are a fun way to better understand a culture. So what is nearest the heart is nearest the mouth. Irish proverb, Irish very expressive culturally. After a storm, fair weather. After sun, joy, or the Russian proverb, also considered a pretty expressive culture. The first to raise their voice loses the argument. It's going to be more of a restrained culture. So things you're going to want to think about is, as you think about the answers to your questions, is there are different conflict styles. So if you're direct, you want to be able to talk through it and understand what happened, but you're not comfortable expressing stronger emotions, you're going to be considered discussion conflict style. If you're engagement style, you're direct, but you're much more comfortable being expressive. This is where I tend to be. If you're accommodation, you're going to be indirect communication style and also restrained. And dynamic is going to be indirect, but also expressive. But one of the challenges where you're going to see the most conflict in a workspace or even in sort of personal relationships is when you're an opposite. So if you are, I am direct and expressive, my husband is indirect and restrained, we have a lot of conflict. We've worked it out over the years. We have a lot of conflict, right? Because I'm like, I want to talk about it. And he was like, I don't want to talk about it. And I'm like, but I want to be emotional about it. He was like, I don't want to show any emotions. And I'm like, I can't read you. You're revolting to me. I don't know what's going on. So we're going to see the most conflict is when people are at opposite ends, but even the direct versus indirect can be complicated. And then because people have such strong reactions to emotion or the non-use of emotion, you'll also see conflict around those. So being aware that people have different conflict styles is going to be really important. Bear in mind that cultural differences can significantly interfere with people's ability to understand one another's goals. So particularly in the collectivism versus individualism, do you really understand how the person is oriented and how they're thinking about the problem? Are they thinking about it as an I problem, or are they thinking about it as a we problem, right? The collectivist. Do we understand what your goals are? Are we interpreting your behaviors through our lens of our expectations? Or do we understand that other people are maybe oriented differently, and are we exploring that effectively, both in terms of how people behave, but also their communication style, and that we can cause us to attribute different meaning to the same set of facts. So even the picture of the car, you all had sort of different, were focused on different things within that picture. Some of you picked on quickly that it had a UK license plate, which I looked at that picture a dozen times and did not notice that. Some people were very quickly like, this person is entitled, obnoxious jerk. Other people were like, I don't have enough information. So again, we can look at the same thing and see it differently. And a lot of that is going to be shaped by our prior expectations and our assumptions of how we are supposed to engage. So again, thinking about different aspects of interactions with colleagues that can be implicated. How do we form trusting relationships that are effective? How do we evaluate credibility, right? If I'm looking at you as a direct person and you're indirect, and I've decided that because you're not coming out and telling me something that therefore you're not credible, that's a problem. How do we develop project strategies and solutions if we're oriented differently from the I to the we? And then how are we gathering information, and are we actually attributing the right thing to what we're seeing in terms of behavior and expressions? We don't know. As lawyers, we need to do the work to make sure we're doing that effectively. Now, keep in mind, and I talked about this in my last presentation, that intercultural conflict is natural. It's going to be expected. If I'm direct and you're indirect, we're going to have some conflict. If I'm expressive and you're not, then we're going to have some conflict. Figuring out how to manage that conflict effectively can be devastating to an organization over time. So keep in mind that you're thinking about how these things play out in your organizations and are actually trying to find ways to navigate them effectively. So when working with your colleagues, think about best how to develop a team, how to build a working relationship. How do you approach scheduling and flexibility? What conversations do you have to have about, scheduling and what your expectations are about what time something is supposed to be? It's on the hour or 15 minutes. Like you're gonna have to articulate that more clearly. How do you communicate? How are you providing feedback? Is it direct? Is it indirect? And then how are you going to navigate the conflict style differences? Keep in mind that effective cross-cultural interactions require us to check ourselves and our interpretations, right? Again, we see things, we make assumptions very quickly, and we may not be able to, we might not realize that we've actually made a lot of logical leaps that are not based on actual and objective information. So make sure when you find yourself doing that, that you go back to the beginning. Describe what you saw, understand what the possible interpretations are, do the work to figure out which interpretation is the correct one, the one that's actually based on more evidence, and then you can make your evaluation or judgment based on that. Something to keep in mind, all interactions are cross-cultural, all of them. So like, it's not just because you're in Italy, you're like, that's a different culture. We all have completely different backgrounds. We were raised very differently. Our expectations about how we engage are incredibly different, right? And now you can see that through how you all answered the questions very differently. Make sure you're taking a non-judgmental approach. We are very judgmental as a people. We get there very quickly, as you can see with the car, that we have no information. So make sure that you're non-judgmental about others and yourself. Have to really remain present in your interactions. Like I said, for a colleague I have who's very indirect, I have to make sure I'm really keyed in to that. I don't have my email on. I don't have my phone near me. I am really just listening and engaged to catch the things that are being implied or hinted at that aren't necessarily directly being said. Do not make the mistake of seeing yourselves too similar. This is something I hear a lot, which is like, we're all people, we're all the same, we all want respect. But what I've tried to highlight through here is we may use words like respect, but we think about them very differently, and how respect manifests, our expectations about that, may be incredibly different. And if we aren't attuned to that, we're going to miss those differences in an important way. You're going to want to make sure you're doing the work to really understand, explore that understanding of others, to ensure that you have a shared understanding. You want to make sure you're relying on facts and not stereotypes. So it's important to understand that cultures may be different, but when you're engaging with someone, make sure you're actually making assessments based on your own interactions with them and not your assessments of, well, people from this place tend to be this way or that way. It's important to know that there are these patterns of differences across cultures, but make sure you're always paying attention to the person in front of you and assessing them based on that. And remember to talk less and listen more. I'll go ahead and send you, so hopefully the Google form got straightened out. If not, we're going to make sure that Jasmine will send out an email for everyone afterwards who attended to let you know the relevant information. I really appreciate you. I apologize I went a few minutes over, and I hope everyone has a really great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we get Jasmine